good evening, and welcome back. Pour whatever you're drinking, water, wine, something stronger if the day calls for it, and settle in, because tonight we're going underground. Literally. Tell me where you are listening from, what city, what room, whether the lights are already off, or whether you're the type who needs them on for a while longer before sleep comes. It doesn't matter to me. I'll be here either way, and so will the story, which has been waiting a very long time for someone to tell it properly. Somewhere beneath the streets of Rome and London and the Rhine frontier and the dusty hill towns of Syria, there are rooms that nobody built to be found. Low ceilings, stone benches running along either wall, a narrow aisle down the middle, like the nave of a church turned inside out and buried, and at the far end, carved into stone or painted onto plaster, a young man in a Persian cap kneeling on the back of a bull, one hand pulling its head back by the nostril, the other driving a blade into its throat. A dog leaps toward the wound. A serpent coils below it. A scorpion attacks the bull's testicles. Above, a raven watches from beside the sun, and on the other side, the moon. Nobody fully agrees on what it means. That's the first thing you need to understand about tonight's story, and I want to say it now, early, before we go any further, because it's going to come up again and again, and I don't want you to feel cheated when it does. The men who once crowded into those underground rooms, soldiers, slaves, freedmen, customs officials, a few senators here and there, left behind almost nothing in writing. They took oaths of silence and, as far as we can tell, kept them. So when I tell you the story of Mithras tonight, I'm doing something a little unusual for this show. I'm braiding together what the stone tells us, what the scattered Roman writers half remembered or half guessed, what the Persian sources from centuries earlier suggest about an older god of the same name, and, yes, what later scholars have reconstructed, argued over, and in some cases simply made up, because the alternative was an unbearable silence. Some say the cult was a foreign import, smuggled into the Roman world by soldiers returning from the eastern frontier with strange new gods packed alongside their kit. Others say it was something more native than that, a Roman invention dressed in Persian clothes, the way a man might wear a costume from a country he's never visited, because the costume makes him feel like someone else. Both of these things might be true. Possibly neither is. We'll walk through it together and you can decide what to believe, though I should warn you, by the end, I'm not sure belief is quite the right word for what this story asks of you. Let's start, as these things should, before there was anything to start with at all. Picture darkness, not the darkness of a room with the lights off. That kind of darkness still has edges, still has a sense of where the walls are, where the door is, where your own hands might be if you reached for them. I mean the other kind, the darkness before edges existed, before meant anything. In the oldest versions of this story, versions that don't belong to Rome at all, but to a much older Persian religious world, the world of Zoroaster and the fire temples of the Iranian plateau, there is no single moment of creation the way the Greeks or the Hebrews told it. There is, instead, a kind of standoff, two principles, ancient beyond reckoning, facing each other across the emptiness. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, principle of light, truth and order, and Angra Mainyu, sometimes called Ahriman, the hostile spirit, principle of darkness, lies, and decay. Neither created the other, neither came first. They simply are, the way two ends of a rope simply are, each one defining itself against the other, neither one able to exist, or at least to mean anything, without its opposite pulling the other way. I find this part of the story genuinely difficult to render, and I want to admit that to you rather than smooth over it, because most retellings smooth over it, and I think something gets lost when they do. We are used to creation stories that begin with a creator, a being who exists first, alone, and then makes everything else. This isn't that. This is a story that begins with a disagreement, cosmic in scale, between two forces who were never not at odds. And into that disagreement, eventually, a third figure steps. Not a creator exactly, not quite a referee either, though that word gets closer than most. His name, at least a name that would eventually travel west, get a Greek ending bolted onto it and end up carved into stone beneath the Aventine Hill, was Mithra, or Mitra if you go back far enough, to the Vedic hymns of India, where a god of the same name, the linguistic cousins, are unmistakable once you see them, presides over contracts, oaths, and the binding agreements that hold society together. Mitra, the word itself, seems to mean something like contract or covenant, a god whose entire portfolio, from the very beginning, was the keeping of promises. Think about that for a moment. Out of all the things a god could be the god of, war, harvest, death, the sea, this one, in his earliest known form, was the god of keeping your word, the god who watches when two people shake hands and makes sure neither one cheats. It seems like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Almost everything that follows in this story, the secret oaths of the Roman cult, the brotherhoods, the grades of initiation that bound a man to his fellow worshippers more tightly than blood, all of it traces back to that one quiet idea. A god born not from violence, not from conquest, but from the simple, fragile, enormously consequential act of two people agreeing to trust each other. In the Avesta, the great collection of Zoroastrian scripture, parts of which are old enough that scholars argue about whether old is even the right word, whether we should instead say ancient beyond the categories we use for ancient. Mithra is described as the one who rises before the sun each morning over the peaks of a mountain whose name translates roughly to the mountain at the navel of the waters, and surveys the whole of the inhabited world with 1,000 ears and 10,000 eyes. He sees everything. He hears everything. And what he is listening for, specifically, is the breaking of oaths. A man swears falsely to a friend, to a business partner, to a king, and somewhere Mithra hears it. The text doesn't say he punishes immediately, and this matters. He waits. He watches the liar go about his life, prosper for a while, perhaps even seem to get away with it, and then, in his own time, in a manner the text describes with a kind of grim, almost geological patience, the consequences arrive. Mithra does not forgive oath breakers, but he is not quick either. He is thorough. I keep coming back to that word, thorough. There's something almost bureaucratic about it, isn't there? A god who keeps records, who doesn't forget, who eventually settles every account. It's not a flashy kind of divinity. There's no thunderbolt throwing here, no wrestling with monsters in the early myths, not yet. Just a presence, watching over the mountains, before dawn, every single day, forever, and yet. And here's where the story starts to gather weight. This quiet, watchful, contract-keeping god would eventually become, in a different country, in a different language, 1,000 years later, the central figure of one of the most intensely physical religions the ancient world ever produced. A religion built around blood, around a knife, around the image, repeated hundreds of times across an empire, of a god killing something with his bare hands. How do you get from the one who watches oaths to the one who kills the bull? That's the question this whole story is trying to answer. And I don't think there's a clean answer. I think there's a messy one, full of centuries we can't see into, full of priests and soldiers and travelers who took an idea from one place and planted it in another, where it grew into something its original gardeners might not have recognized at all. But messy answers are often the true ones. So let's keep going. Somewhere in that long darkness before history properly begins, and I mean that literally, the records simply stop. The way a road might just end at the edge of a map with nothing marked beyond it but blank parchment. There was, it seems, a kind of cosmic realignment. The old gods of an even older Indo-Iranian world, gods shared, in some dim ancestral sense, by the people who would become both the Vedic Indians and the Iranian peoples, began to sort themselves. Some stayed close to the earth, to cattle and rivers and the small daily transactions of human life. Others rose. Mithra rose. By the time we have any solid textual footing, and solid here is a generous word, Mithra has been folded into a triad alongside Ahura Mazda and a goddess of the waters named Anahita. Not equal to Ahura Mazda, not quite, but close. A kind of vizier, if that word means anything to you. The figure who stands just below the throne, who carries out the will of the supreme god, who deals directly with the world of men because the supreme god, in his vastness, in his wiseness, has perhaps grown too large, too abstract, too far away to deal with men directly anymore. This is a pattern you'll see again and again in religious history, by the way. I'll point it out once now and then leave it alone, because I don't want to turn this into a lecture, but it's worth noticing. The longer a religion lasts, the more its highest god tends to recede, becoming vaster and stranger and less involved, while a second figure steps forward to actually deal with people. A mediator, a go-between, someone closer to human scale who can be approached, bargained with, related to, while the original god sits somewhere unimaginably far above, still technically in charge, but functionally retired from the day-to-day business of being prayed to. Mithra became that figure, the approachable one, the one you could swear an oath by, because he was the one who'd actually hear it. And then, somewhere around the 6th century before our era, in the court of the Persian kings, the Achaemenids, the dynasty of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, something happened that the historical record can just barely glimpse, like a shape moving behind frosted glass. Mithra's worship spread, not replacing the official Zoroastrian reverence for Ahura Mazda. The Persian kings remained devoted to Ahura Mazda, at least officially, at least in their inscriptions. but growing alongside it, underneath it, the way ivy grows up a wall without ever claiming to be the wall. Soldiers swore by Mithra before battle. Kings invoked him alongside Ahura Mazda and Anahita in their formal proclamations. Artaxerxes II, if the inscriptions are read correctly, names all three together, which tells you something about how high Mithra had climbed by then. And in the western provinces of the Persian Empire, in Anatolia, in the kingdoms that would later be called Pontus and Cappadocia and Commagene, places where Persian governors had ruled for generations and where Persian religious ideas had had centuries to mix with Greek ones, with local Anatolian ones, with whatever older substrate of belief had been there before any of them arrived. Mithra started to change shape. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a lot of popular retellings get sloppy, and I don't want to be one of them. We do not have a clean, documented, step-by-step account of how the Persian god Mithra became the Roman god Mithras. What we have is a gap, a real, genuine, frustrating gap of several centuries. And on one side of the gap stands a Persian deity associated with oaths, contracts, the sun, and cosmic order, worshipped as far as we can tell, without underground temples, without the bull-slaying image, without the elaborate grade system. And on the other side of the gap stands a Roman god, worshipped almost exclusively in small underground chambers centered on the bull-slaying image, with a 7-grade initiation system that maps, and this is one of the genuinely eerie details, one that even hardened skeptics have to sit with for a moment, maps remarkably well onto the 7 classical planets and their associated metals. Something happened in that gap. Something transformed the god. And whatever it was, it happened largely in the region we now call Eastern Anatolia, Commagene specifically, a small kingdom wedged between larger powers, ruled by a dynasty that claimed descent from both Persian nobility and Greek royalty, a dynasty that, in one of the strangest monuments to survive from the ancient world, built a colossal sanctuary on a mountaintop called Nemrut Dar, where enormous stone heads, Zeus, Apollo, Hercules, and yes, Mithras among them, though here given a Greek name and Greek features alongside his Persian cap, sat in a row, gazing out over the landscape as if the kingdom's rulers were trying, quite literally, to build a bridge in stone between two religious worlds. I think about those heads sometimes, decapitated now, fallen from their bodies sometime in the centuries since. Nobody's entirely sure when or how, whether earthquake or deliberate destruction. They still sit in rows on that mountaintop, 2,000 meters up, cold most of the year, and they still look, more than anything else I can think of, like a committee, like a meeting that's been going on for 2,000 years and just hasn't adjourned yet. But the bull, we need to talk about the bull, because everything from this point forward circles back to it, and I've been putting it off, not deliberately, or maybe deliberately. I'm honestly not sure, because it's the part of the story that's hardest to tell without it sounding either ridiculous or worse, like something out of a horror film. It is neither, or it's both. I'll let you decide once you've heard it in the Zoroastrian tradition. And remember, we're now moving slightly sideways from the strict Mithra material into the broader cosmology that surrounded it, because the bull doesn't belong to Mithra alone. Not at first. There is a creature called the primordial bull. Some texts call it Gavevodata, which is about as easy to say as it looks. This bull was, according to the myths, the first living creature created by Ahura Mazda at the dawn of the material world, existing in a kind of perfect, untroubled state, pure, white, radiant, the template from which all other animal life would eventually derive. And then Ahriman, the hostile spirit, the dark twin, the one who exists purely to unmake what the other has made, killed it. This is, in the Zoroastrian framework, the first death, the first violence, the wound that the entire material world carries forever afterward, the way a person might carry a scar from a childhood injury, visible or not, for the rest of their life. The primordial bull dies, and from its body, from its marrow, from its seed, from its blood soaking into the earth, everything else comes. Every plant, every animal, every species that has ever lived or will ever live, in some versions, springs from the body of that first slaughtered bull, the way grain springs from a field after the harvest has cut everything down to stubble. Death, in other words, is not the opposite of life in this story. Death is the mechanism of life. The bull has to die for anything else to exist at all. Now, and here is where the threads start to weave together. Here is where Mithra steps fully onto the stage in the form most of you will recognize from those underground rooms. In the Roman version of this myth, the version we find carved into stone in Mithraea. That's the plural, by the way, of Mithraeum, the name given to these underground temples. From Britain to Syria, it is not Ahriman who kills the bull. It's Mithras. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's strange, and the strangeness doesn't go away no matter how many times you turn it over. In the Persian source material, the killing of the bull is an act of cosmic vandalism, the destructive principle attacking the creative principle, darkness wounding light, the great tragedy that the rest of existence has to recover from. But in the Roman cult, the same act, the same image, more or less, a figure plunging a blade into a bull's neck, is performed by the good God, the Lightbringer, the one whose name means covenant. And it is not depicted as a tragedy at all. It's depicted as a triumph. Look at the image again. And if you have access to a picture of a Tauroctony, that's the technical name for this scene, from the Greek for bull slaying, I genuinely encourage you to pause and look at one while I describe it, because the visual details matter, and I don't think words quite capture the composition of it. The way it's almost always arranged the same, scene after scene, temple after temple, as if every artist who ever carved one had been handed the exact same instructions and told not to deviate. Mithras kneels on the bull's back, one knee pressing it down. His head is turned away from the act, almost always turned away, looking back over his shoulder, often toward the sun, toward Saul, who watches from one corner of the composition. His cloak billows out behind him, and very often that cloak is painted or carved to show the night sky, stars, sometimes specific constellations. One hand grips the bull by the nostril or the horn, yanking the head back, exposing the throat. The other hand drives a short sword or dagger into the animal's neck or shoulder. And then, this is the part that gets stranger the longer you look at it. from the wound or near it, life erupts. In many depictions, the bull's tail transforms into stalks of wheat, 3 ears of grain sprouting from where the tail should be, sometimes more. A dog leaps toward the blood. A snake reaches up from the ground toward it too. A scorpion. And this detail unsettles people every time I mention it. I've noticed there's something about the specificity of it. A scorpion attacks the bull at its genitals, pincers closing on the testicles, as if even in this moment of cosmic creation, there's an attack happening within the attack, a smaller violence nested inside the larger one. Above all of this, in the upper corners of almost every Tauroctony that survives, are 2 figures. Sol, the sun, usually shown as a head with rays, sometimes riding a chariot, and Luna, the moon, shown the same way, but with a crescent. Between them, often, is a raven, and the raven, in the grade system we'll get to later, is the name of the lowest rank of initiate, which tells you that whatever was happening in this image, the people looking at it were meant to see themselves in it too. Somewhere, at the bottom, watching. What does it mean, honestly? And I say this not as a cop-out, but because I think it's the most truthful thing I can tell you. Nobody knows. Not for certain. The Romans who carved these images and knelt before them left behind almost no explanatory texts. We have inscriptions. We have dedications. We have the physical layout of the temples themselves, which is its own kind of evidence, and which I'll get to. But we don't have a Mithraic gospel, a Mithraic scripture that says, in plain language, this is what the bull slaying represents, and this is why it matters. So scholars have guessed. For more than a century, they've guessed, and the guesses have ranged from the elegant to the frankly bizarre. One influential guess, and I'll come back to this because I think it might actually be the closest anyone's gotten, is astronomical. The bull is the constellation Taurus. The scorpion is Scorpio. The serpent might be Hydra or serpens. The raven, Corvus. And Mithras, plunging his dagger into the bull's neck, isn't killing an animal at all. He's depicting, in symbolic form, a shift in the heavens themselves, the precession of the equinoxes, an extremely slow wobble in the Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of the stars at the spring equinox to drift over thousands of years from one zodiac constellation to the next. For roughly 2,000 years before the Roman cult emerged, call it 4,000 to 2,000 BCE, give or take, the spring equinox sun rose in Taurus, the age of the bull, if you like that kind of language, and a lot of ancient cultures did, in one form or another. Then slowly, over centuries too long, for any single human being to notice within their own lifetime, the equinox point drifted into Aries, the ram. The age of Taurus ended. Something ended it, and if you were a person living in the Roman world 2,000 years after that astronomical handoff had already happened, looking back at an event so slow it could only be perceived through accumulated record keeping, through priesthoods that had watched the sky for generation after generation and compared notes. You might tell a story about it. You might say, a god killed the bull. You might say, the god who did it stands outside the wheel of the zodiac, not bound by it, capable of reaching in and ending an entire cosmic age with his own hand, which would make him, by definition, more powerful than time itself, more powerful than the stars. a god who could move the heavens. I find that reading genuinely beautiful, and I want to be honest that I'm drawn to it more than I probably should be, given how contested it is among people who study this for a living. But even if it's wrong, even if the real explanation is something more mundane, some lost local cult myth from a single Anatolian valley that just happened to get adopted wholesale by soldiers and merchants moving along trade routes, the way a song from a small town can end up, a generation later, being sung by people who've never heard of the town and have no idea where it came from, even then. I think the fact that this is the kind of explanation people reach for tells you something about what the cult felt like from the inside. It felt like it was about time, about the turning of ages, about a god who stood at the hinge point between one era of the world and the next, and who did something violent, something necessary, something that produced life out of death, to make the turning happen. Let's pause here for a moment. We've covered the deep background, the Persian roots, the long silence, the bull, the stars. And before we go further into the human side of this story, the soldiers and freedmen and senators who actually crawled down into these rooms and knelt before these images, I want to take a breath. I need to pause here, actually, because the next stretch of the story moves much faster than what's come before. And faster stories have a way of leaving things behind if you're not careful. And there are a few things I don't want to leave behind. 1. The cult of Mithras, as it existed in the Roman Empire, say, from roughly the 1st century of our era to its slow extinguishing in the 4th, was not the same thing as the Persian worship of Mithra, even though it borrowed the name, the Persian dress, the Eastern flavor. Roman writers themselves seemed aware of this. The Greek biographer Plutarch, writing around the turn of the 2nd century, mentions that Mithraic rites were brought to Rome by pirates, actual pirates, Cilician pirates defeated by Pompey the Great in the 1st century BCE, who were resettled in southern Italy and apparently brought their religious practices with them. Whether that's literally true or a kind of origin legend that grew up later, it tells you that even the Romans themselves understood this as something foreign, something with an exotic pedigree, even if the actual temples and rituals were thoroughly, almost obsessively Roman in their physical form, built underground in cities, often beneath ordinary houses, using Roman construction techniques, dedicated by men with Roman names holding Roman jobs. 2. And this is the detail that I think gets lost most often, so I want to plant it firmly here before we move on. This was a cult almost entirely of men, not exclusively. There's a little evidence, contested, of women's involvement in some places, particularly outside Italy, but overwhelmingly, decisively, the membership we can trace through inscriptions is male. Soldiers, customs officials, slaves and freedmen working in imperial administration, a few aristocrats. And this matters because it shapes everything about how the religion functioned, as a brotherhood, as a network, as something closer to what we might now call a fraternal order or a guild than to a public religion in the way we usually think of one. 3. The temples were small. I want you to really absorb this, because the imagery, the cosmic battles, the ages of the world, the bull, the stars, might give you the impression of something grand, something with vast cathedral-like spaces. The opposite is true. A Mithraeum typically held somewhere between 20 and 40 people, sometimes fewer. Long, narrow, low-ceilinged, deliberately built to evoke a cave. Sometimes an actual cave, sometimes a converted basement or warehouse room with a ceiling artificially lowered and vaulted to feel like stone overhead, like the sky had been replaced with rock. The benches along the sides weren't for sitting in rows facing forward, the way a church is arranged. They faced each other across the narrow central aisle, the way the benches in a ship's mess hall might face each other. Or, and I think this is closer to the truth, the way men around a campfire face each other, faces lit from below by lamps and torches whose flickering would have animated the painted stars on the ceiling, made the carved figures on the walls seem to move. It would have been hot, it would have been smoky, it would have almost certainly smelled of oil lamps, of incense, of the meat that was cooked and shared at the communal meals that were apparently central to the cult's practice. Meals that some ancient critics, looking at this new religion from the outside with a kind of hostile curiosity that hostile outsiders always bring, compared unfavorably and pointedly to a different set of meals involving bread and wine that another new religion of the same era was also becoming known for. I'll come back to that comparison. It's not an accident, and the people making it at the time didn't think it was an accident either. Anyway, let's talk about the 7 grades, because this is where the cult's internal logic becomes, I think, genuinely moving. Not in spite of its strangeness, but because of it. To become a Mithraist wasn't a single act. It wasn't like being baptized, a one-time threshold you crossed and then was simply in. It was a climb. A man entered the cult at the bottom, and over years, we don't know exactly how many, the sources are frustratingly quiet on the timeline, could ascend through 7 distinct ranks, each one associated with a planet, a metal, a protective deity, and, we think, based on a few surviving descriptions and one famous mosaic floor in Ostia that lays the whole sequence out in order. A particular ordeal or test to be passed before advancement. At the bottom, the raven, Corax, associated with Mercury, with the metal. Well, the sources are inconsistent, but broadly with something base, something unrefined. The raven was a servant in the communal meals, performing menial tasks, perhaps wearing a mask. There's evidence of animal masks being used in some of these rituals, which is one of those details that, the first time you encounter it, makes the whole thing feel suddenly much stranger and much more theatrical than the solemn stone carvings might suggest. Picture it: grown men, soldiers, officials, sitting in a smoky underground room, wearing bird masks, serving food to each other, performing roles in what was, among other things, clearly also a kind of drama, a kind of play that everyone present had agreed to take seriously. Above the raven, the bridegroom, Nymphus, a strange grade, this one, associated with Venus, and the name itself, it's actually a slightly irregular, possibly deliberately invented Greek word related to nymph, meaning bride, suggests some kind of symbolic marriage, perhaps to the cult itself, or to Mithras, or to the light. We don't know the details of what this involved, and I won't pretend to. Then, the soldier, Miles, associated with Mars, naturally, given the name. And this is the grade where the military character of the cult becomes most explicit, where initiates may have undergone something resembling a recruitment oath, a sacramentum, the same word the Roman army used for the oath a soldier swore to his commander and to Rome itself. There's a passage, I'll paraphrase rather than quote it directly, because the wording matters less than the gesture, describing an initiation in which a crown is offered to the candidate on the point of a sword, and the candidate is expected to refuse it, to push it away, saying that Mithras alone is his crown. It's a small moment. It might even sound, described baldly like this, almost silly. But think about what it's doing. It's taking the most basic transaction of Roman military and political life, the offering and accepting of honors, of rank, of advancement, and inverting it. Refusing the crown becomes the mark of true loyalty. The man who wants nothing for himself is the man who can be trusted completely. I keep thinking about that gesture. A crown on a sword point, and a hand pushing it away. There's something in that image that feels, I don't quite have the word for it, rehearsed, maybe, in the best sense. Like something a man might practice in his head for weeks before the night it actually happened, turning the moment over, wondering if he'd managed to keep his hands steady, wondering what his face would look like to the others watching. 4th grade, the lion, Leo, associated with Jupiter. And here the symbolism shifts toward fire. Lions were linked, in the broader Mithraic cosmology, with the element of fire and with a stage of purification. There's a striking passage from a Christian critic describing lion-grade initiates having honey poured over their hands and tongues instead of water, because fire should not be touched by anything that quenches flame, which, whatever its accuracy, is a beautiful piece of imagery. The idea that a man could become so thoroughly identified with fire that even washing his hands had to be reimagined. 5th, the Persian, Perses, associated somewhat counterintuitively with the moon, and this grade explicitly invoked the cult's Eastern origins, even as it sat near the top of an organization run almost entirely by Romans who had probably never been east of Greece in their lives. There's something worth sitting with there too, a kind of imagined geography, an idealized elsewhere that the cult kept reaching toward without ever quite needing to visit. 6th, the runner of the sun, Heliodromus, associated with the sun itself, naturally, second only to the very top, and depicted in some images as a figure with a radiate crown, a torch, sometimes shown driving a chariot. Sol's earthly representative, perhaps, the cult's living echo of the god who watches the Tauroctony from the corner of every relief. And at the very top, the father, Pater, associated with Saturn, oldest and most distant of the planets known to the ancient world, and the grade that carried actual authority within a given Mithraeum. A Pater could found a new Mithraeum, could preside over initiations, could, in a phrase I find quietly devastating once you sit with it, be the local Mithras, in some functional sense, for the men below him. Inscriptions sometimes record a single man holding the title of Pater for decades, presiding over the same small underground room, watching new ravens become soldiers, become lions, become, eventually, fathers themselves, who would go on to found their own Mithraea elsewhere, carrying the same 7-step ladder with them, like a folded tent, ready to be pitched again in a new city, a new province, a new life. 7 grades, 7 planets. A man could spend the better part of his adult life climbing this ladder. A soldier posted to Britain at 20 might, by the time he was discharged at 45 or 50, have risen from raven to father, might have founded his own Mithraeum in retirement, might have spent his final years as a presiding figure in some small underground room in a town he'd never have seen if the army hadn't sent him there, surrounded by men he'd recruited himself, men who called him father in a literal, ritual, structurally real sense, even if his own children, if he had any, called him something else entirely in the house just upstairs. That's not nothing. I don't think that's nothing at all. Now, heroes. I promised heroes, and the structure of this kind of story always asks for individuals, for faces, names, lives we can follow from beginning to end, because cosmic forces and astronomical ages are all well and good, but human beings, in the end, need people to care about. So let's meet a few. Some of these figures are gods, or god-adjacent, characters from the myth itself. Others are men who actually existed, as far as the stone record can tell us. Men whose names survive on dedications and tombstones, whose lives we can sketch, however thinly, from the traces they left behind. I'll move between the two without much warning, because honestly, by the time you're 300 feet underground in a smoky room lit by oil lamps, staring at a god killing a bull while a man your father's age tells you what your new name within the brotherhood is going to be, I'm not sure the line between myth and biography would have felt as sharp to the people living it as it does to us, reading about it centuries later by a different kind of light. Our first figure is Mithras himself, and I mean specifically the Mithras of the birth scenes, which survive in a handful of reliefs and which depict something genuinely strange even by the standards of everything we've covered so far. The god emerging fully formed from solid rock, Petra Genetrix, the generative rock, sometimes shown with the god's upper body already free, torch in each hand, while his legs are still encased in stone, as if he is in the process of being born from the earth itself, a birth with no mother, no labor in any conventional sense, just emergence. Some reliefs show shepherds nearby, startled, reaching toward him, sometimes even kneeling. And yes, the echo is there, the echo that later viewers from a different and ultimately more successful religious tradition could hardly have failed to notice. A divine birth witnessed by shepherds in a humble setting, heralding something the world didn't yet understand. I don't think it's a coincidence, and I also don't think it's evidence that one religion copied the other in any simple sense. These motifs were floating around the Eastern Mediterranean like spores, landing in different religious soil and growing into different shapes, and trying to draw a clean arrow from one to the other probably says more about the people drawing the arrow than about the ancient world itself. But the shepherds are there. The miraculous birth from earth rather than from a woman is there, and the torch-bearing god, born already holding light in both hands, born, in other words, already doing the one thing his entire mythology will turn out to be about. That's there too. And I think It's one of the most quietly perfect images in the whole tradition. A god who arrives already illuminated, who doesn't become light through some later achievement, the way a hero might earn a title through deeds. He simply is. From the very first moment anyone sees him, the torches are already burning. After the birth, and the sources here become even more fragmentary, more dependent on a handful of relief panels arranged in sequence around the edges of certain Mithraea. Panels that scholars have had to read almost like a comic strip, frame by frame, guessing at the connective tissue between images. Mithras performs a series of what we might as well call labors, echoing, deliberately or not, the labors of Hercules, another figure whose stone face, you'll remember, sat in that same row of heads on the Commagene mountaintop. He confronts the bull, not yet killing it, not in this scene, but capturing it, wrestling it, in some panels shown carrying it bodily across his shoulders, the animal's legs splayed out on either side of his neck, its weight visibly enormous, Mithras's whole body bent under the strain. There's a panel showing the bull being driven or dragged toward a cave, the same cave shape that every Mithraeum was built to evoke, which means that every single time an initiate walked into one of these underground rooms, he was, in some sense, walking into the myth itself, standing in the same cave where the god had once dragged a reluctant, enormous, world-creating animal toward his death. He performs a miracle with water. In one relief, Mithras kneels and shoots an arrow into a rock face, and water springs from the point of impact, and there are men nearby catching the water in their cupped hands or in vessels, drinking it, grateful. A small scene, easy to miss if you didn't know to look for it. But think about what it's doing, sitting there quietly among the grander cosmic imagery. It's a god providing for thirsty men, not judging them, not testing them in this particular moment, just giving them water because they needed it, in a desert, with an arrow and a rock. And then, after the bull slaying, after the central act, the one we've already spent so much time on, there's a banquet. Mithras and Sol, the sun god, recline together at a table, sharing a meal, often shown seated on the hide of the slain bull itself, the animal's own skin now serving as their dining couch, which is either the most darkly practical detail in the entire mythology or the most pointed piece of symbolism in it, possibly both. They eat bread, they drink from a cup. Sol, in some versions, extends his hand to Mithras, a gesture of alliance, of recognition. Two powers who might have been rivals instead choosing, after the violence is done, to sit down together. This banquet scene, by the way, sat at the back of many Mithraea, at the far end of the room, beyond the Tauroctony itself, sometimes in a separate niche or apse, which means that the communal meals the initiates themselves shared, the meat, the bread, the wine, the masks, the ravens serving the lions, happened in front of, underneath, in the physical presence of this image of two gods doing the exact same thing. The men below were not just remembering a sacred meal, they were, for the duration of their own dinner, inside one, eating in the same posture, in the same room, beneath the same painted stars as the gods they believed had eaten there first. I don't know how to make that feel as strange as it actually is. I've tried a few different ways of phrasing it, and none of them quite land. There's something about the ordinariness of a meal. The fact that everyone reading this has eaten dinner today, probably without thinking about it twice. And the idea that a group of Roman soldiers 2,000 years ago, in a freezing stone room under London or Mainz or Dura Europos, might have felt, even for a moment, even half believing it, even after a long day of unglamorous administrative work, that they were dining with gods, that the bread in their hands was the same bread, that the wine was the same wine. I think that's one of the things religion is for, honestly, closing that distance, even briefly, even unconvincingly, making the extraordinary available on a Tuesday. Our second figure I want to introduce is not a god at all, but a man, or rather, the closest thing we have to a man, which is a name on a piece of stone, surrounded by just enough other information to let us build, carefully, a kind of ghost in Rome on the Aventine Hill, beneath the church of Santa Prisca. And I want to pause on that detail too. A church built directly above a Mithraeum, the new religion literally constructed on top of the old one's buried bones, which happens often enough across this story that it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something closer to a habit, almost a compulsion on the part of the religion that won. Beneath that church, excavators found a Mithraeum with an unusually rich set of painted inscriptions, including the names of several of its members, recorded over what appears to have been multiple generations of use, from roughly the 2nd century into the early 4th. One of those names belonged to a man who appears to have held high rank within the community. We can't reconstruct his full biography, not even close, but the fragments that survive are enough to imagine around. A freedman, in all likelihood, someone born enslaved, who gained his freedom at some point, probably through the favor of a wealthy household, and who then, in the way that many freedmen did in this period, built a life for himself within the vast administrative machinery of the Roman world. Perhaps he worked in the customs service, or in the household staff of a senator, or in some minor capacity within the imperial bureaucracy. The kind of job that left almost no trace in the grand narratives of history, but that multiplied by tens of thousands of similar men across the empire was actually what ran the empire day to day, far more than any emperor or general ever did. And in his off hours, in the evenings presumably, after whatever work had occupied his daylight, he went underground, literally underground, into a converted room beneath what might once have been a private house. And there, among other men in similar positions, other freedmen, other minor officials, men whose names we also have, fragments of names painted in red ochre on plaster that has survived against all odds for nearly 2,000 years. He was, for a few hours, something other than what he was during the day. He was a lion, or a father. We don't know which exactly for this particular man, though the inscriptions at Santa Prisca do preserve the great titles of several members, arranged in lists that look almost like a roster, almost like a club membership board you might see on the wall of a lodge today. And I keep coming back to that comparison. A lodge, a club, a brotherhood, because I think it's the most honest way to describe what this was on the human level, underneath all the cosmology and the astronomy and the ages of the world. It was a place where a man who spent his days being told what to do by a master, by a superior, by the simple grinding fact of his social position, could go at night and be called father, could be the one who knew the secrets, could preside. There's a kind of dignity in that I find difficult to write about without either overstating it or underselling it. And I think I'm going to fail at getting the balance exactly right. So I'll just say it plainly and let it sit. For a great many of the men who belong to this cult, it may have been one of the only spaces in their entire lives where the hierarchy that governed everything else, birth, wealth, citizenship, the whole vast machinery of Roman status, simply didn't apply, or applied differently, or could be climbed through years of devotion and ritual and shared meals in a way that the world above ground would never, ever allow. Third figure, and here I want to shift to the frontier, because the cult's character changes noticeably depending on where you find it, and the frontier versions feel, to me, the most lived in of all the evidence we have. Along Hadrian's Wall, in the north of Britain, about as far from Rome, culturally and geographically, as the empire stretched in this period, there's a site called Caroburg, where a Mithraeum was excavated in the middle of the 20th century and found to contain, among other things, 3 altars dedicated by successive commanding officers of the fort, each one apparently making his own dedication upon taking up his post, as if joining the local cult was simply part of the standard handover procedure, something a new commander did in the same week. He inspected the granaries and reviewed the duty rosters. One of those altars belonged to a man. And here, again, we have a name, though I won't burden you with the exact spelling, because it's the kind of name that exists mostly to be misremembered, who commanded a unit of Batavian soldiers, men recruited from what's now the Netherlands, posted to the bleak, wet, endlessly windy edge of the Roman world to guard a wall against people the Romans called, with a certain weary contempt, simply the barbarians beyond. Imagine that posting. Imagine being a young Batavian, or commanding a unit of them, stationed at a fort in what is now Northumberland, England, in, let's say, the early 3rd century. The weather is nothing like home. The local population is hostile, or at best wary. The frontier is not quiet exactly, but not in active crisis either, which in some ways is worse, because it means you're not fighting a war. You're just waiting, year after year, for a war that might or might not come, doing drills, doing maintenance, watching the weather change and change again, growing older in a place that will never, no matter how long you stay, feel like it's yours. And then, somewhere just outside the fort's walls, close enough to walk to, but deliberately set apart, half buried, with a stream running nearby because running water seems to have mattered to where these temples were sited. There's a low stone building with a door that has to be dug through. Inside, benches along the walls, an altar at the far end, the carved Tauroctony lit by oil lamps, the smoke gathering against the ceiling because there's nowhere else for it to go. And inside that room, for a few hours, in the dark, surrounded by men he'd commanded all day and would command again tomorrow. But who, in here, might outrank him, might be lions while he was still only a soldier, might have things to teach him that nothing in his actual military career had prepared him for. He was, for a little while, somewhere else, not in Britain, not on the edge of the world, in a cave that was also the cosmos, watching a god kill a bull so that the world could keep existing, eating bread that was also, somehow, more than bread. I don't know what that man believed, in the sense of believed the way we sometimes mean it now, as a checklist of propositions held to be true. I suspect that's not even the right question to ask of him. I suspect, and this is speculation. I want to be clear. This is me reaching. This is the part where the historian in me would put down the pen and the storyteller in me picks it back up. I suspect that what he had, more than belief, was a place to go, a room, a brotherhood, a few hours once a week or once a month, where the wind outside didn't matter, where the years stacking up on the calendar didn't matter, where he was, briefly, exactly where he was supposed to be. I want to pause again. Not for as long this time, just a breath. Because we're coming up on the part of the story that gets harder, and I think it's worth marking the turn. Everything so far has been, in its way, a story of expansion. A god born in the Persian highlands, traveling west, gathering new images, new grades, new meanings, planting small underground rooms in cities and forts across an enormous empire, men climbing ladders, brotherhoods forming, the whole thing growing, quietly, never officially sanctioned by the state the way the cult of the deified emperors was, never built a grand public temple the way Jupiter or Isis or Cybele eventually got, but growing nonetheless, room by room, generation by generation, for roughly 2.5 centuries. And then it stopped. Not all at once. Nothing in this story happens all at once. I think that's been one of the threads running through everything we've covered tonight, actually, now that I say it out loud. This is a religion that seems to move at the speed of geology, slow accumulations, slow shifts, the precession of the equinoxes, a process too gradual for any single worshipper to witness with their own eyes, sitting at the very center of the cult's central image. Maybe it's fitting then, maybe it's the cruelest kind of fitting, that the cult's ending was slow, too. Slow enough that for a long time, the people living through it might not have fully realized it was happening. Our fourth figure brings us to that ending, or close to it, as close as the evidence lets us get. There's a Mithraeum beneath the church of Santa Maria Capua Vetere near Naples, and another, more famously, beneath San Clemente in Rome. And at several sites across the empire, archaeologists have found something that, the first time you encounter it, takes a moment to process, because it doesn't look like destruction. It looks like care. The Tauroctony reliefs at a number of Mithraea. Not all, but enough that it forms a recognizable pattern, were found not smashed, not defaced, with the kind of furious overstrike you sometimes see on images of disgraced emperors or hated gods, where a face is chiseled away in a few violent strokes, clearly done in anger, clearly done to erase. Instead, in these Mithraea, the images were found carefully buried, covered over, the room filled in with earth and rubble, gently, almost. And I know this is an odd word to reach for, but it's the one that keeps coming to mind, almost tenderly, as if someone had decided that the images couldn't be allowed to remain visible, couldn't be allowed to keep being worshipped, but also couldn't simply be smashed, as if smashing them would have been a kind of violence the person doing the burying wasn't willing or wasn't able to commit. We don't know who did this, in most cases. We don't know if it was Christian authorities moving methodically through a city decommissioning the religious infrastructure of a faith whose time had passed. We don't know if it was, in some cases, the cult's own members, the last generation of initiates, men who could see which way the wind was blowing, who knew that their sons would not be ravens and lions the way they had been, and who chose themselves to put their God to bed rather than leave him exposed to whatever was coming. I think about that second possibility more than I probably should, and I want to be honest that I can't defend it as more likely than the first. The evidence doesn't really support either reading over the other, not conclusively. But there's something about the gentleness of these burials that keeps pulling me back toward it. A god who arrives already holding light in both hands, born from rock, witnessed by startled shepherds. And centuries later, the men who had spent their lives climbing toward him, father after father, Mithraeum after Mithraeum, laying him back down into the earth he came from, not destroying him, just putting him away, the way you might fold a flag after the last ceremony, when you know there won't be another. The broader context, for what it's worth, is not gentle at all. Through the 4th century, as Christianity moved from a persecuted minority faith to the favored, and then the only legally permitted, religion of the Roman state, the older cults, all of them, not just Mithras's, came under increasing pressure. Temples were closed by imperial decree. Funding that had once supported public sacrifices was redirected or simply cut off. In some cities, Christian mobs, sometimes with the tacit or explicit approval of local authorities, sometimes acting against their wishes, attacked temples directly. And there's at least one famous account from Alexandria of a Mithraic sanctuary being violently exposed, its contents apparently including human skulls, which the account's Christian author presents with predictable horror as evidence of the cult's depravity, though modern readers might wonder whether those skulls had a more mundane explanation involving simple burial customs of the area, being paraded through the streets as proof of the old religion's monstrousness. But for most, Mithraea, small, private, hidden by design even in their heyday, the end probably looked less like a riot and more like an absence. A room that 1 year simply wasn't used anymore. A father who died or was reassigned, or simply grew too old to make the journey down the stairs, and who had no successor because the men who might have become ravens and soldiers and lions in the next generation had by then found their brotherhoods elsewhere, in the new religion, the one with its own meals of bread and wine, its own initiations, its own promise of a life beyond this one, but offered, crucially, in the open, in daylight, in buildings that announce themselves rather than hiding beneath ordinary houses with nothing but a low door to mark them. By the early 5th century, as far as the evidence shows, the cult of Mithras, at least in any organized continuing form, was gone. Not banned by a single dramatic edict bearing its name specifically, the way some other practices were. Just gone, absorbed, abandoned, buried, forgotten, in roughly that order, over roughly a century, across an empire that was itself, by then, beginning to come apart in ways that had nothing to do with religion at all. I want to talk now about the things that don't fit easily into a story with heroes and villains and endings. The abstract things, the ideas that ran underneath everything we've covered, because I think they're the part of this religion that has the best claim to still mattering, in some form, even now, even to people who've never heard the word Mithraeum before tonight. The first is light against darkness. And I know, that sounds like the most generic possible religious dichotomy, the kind of thing every tradition claims for itself. And I'd usually be suspicious of leaning on it too. But in this case, I think it's worth taking literally, almost physically, rather than just symbolically. These were temples built to be dark, deliberately, structurally dark, windowless, underground, every available surface working to keep daylight out. And into that engineered darkness, light was introduced. Oil lamps, torches, sometimes in a few Mithraea, small apertures positioned with what looks like genuine astronomical precision, so that on certain days of the year, a beam of actual sunlight would fall across the Tauroctony at a particular angle, illuminating the god's face or the bull's wound for a few minutes before moving on. A religion that built darkness on purpose so that light could be made to arrive. Not light as the ambient, unremarkable condition of daytime, the light you don't think about because it's just always there. But light as an event, something that happened, that you waited for, that meant something specifically because of the darkness it was cutting through. I think that's worth sitting with for people who don't share any of this religion-specific beliefs at all. Honestly, there's something true in it about how meaning works in general, how very little means anything against a background of more of the same, and how much can mean everything against the background of its absence. The second idea, and this one's harder to talk about without sounding either obvious or in the other direction, like I'm reading too much into a handful of inscriptions, is the idea of the soul's journey through the planetary spheres after death. This isn't unique to Mithraism. Versions of it show up across a huge swath of late antique religious and philosophical thought, in various Gnostic systems, in some strands of Platonism, in ideas that would eventually filter into early Christian and Jewish mysticism too. But the 7 Mithric grades, mapped onto the 7 planets, suggest, and this is one of those places where the suggestion is strong enough that even cautious scholars tend to lean into it, that the ascent through the grades during life was understood as a kind of rehearsal for an ascent through the planetary spheres after death, that each grade wasn't just a title, a rank within an earthly brotherhood, but a kind of practice familiarity with a stage of the soul's journey upward, out of the material world, through sphere after sphere, shedding something at each one, passions, attachments, whatever the metals and the planets were thought to represent, until what arrived at the top, at Saturn's sphere and beyond, was something lighter than what had set out. A man who had been a raven, a bridegroom, a soldier, a lion, a Persian, a runner of the sun, and finally a father, who had, across years, practiced each of those identities, worn each of those masks, however briefly, in the smoky dark of an underground room, might have believed, when his actual death came, that he already knew the route, that he'd walked it before, in rehearsal, surrounded by men who called him by names that weren't his name, in a cave that wasn't a cave, under a sky that was painted rather than real, and that none of that had made it less real, exactly the opposite, that the rehearsals were what would let him recognize the real journey when it finally came, the way a familiar tune can be recognized in an instant, even played on an unfamiliar instrument, in an unfamiliar key, by someone you've never met. I don't know if that's true in any sense that matters to anyone who isn't themselves walking that journey right now, but I find it a strangely comforting thought, regardless, that there might be value in rehearsal, that the things we practice, even if we don't fully understand why, even if the real version of whatever we're practicing for never quite arrives in the form we expect, that the practicing itself might not be wasted, might be its own kind of arrival, the third and last of these big ideas. And I'll be brief about it, because I think by now you can probably feel where it's heading, is secrecy itself. Not secrecy as concealment for its own sake, or for some practical reason like avoiding persecution, though that may have played a part too, especially in the cult's final century. I mean secrecy as a technology, a tool for producing a particular kind of relationship between people. The men in the Mithraeum knew something the men outside didn't. Not necessarily anything that, written down and handed to an outsider, would seem like much. We've established that the actual content of Mithraic doctrine, as far as we can reconstruct it, isn't wildly more exotic than a lot of other ancient religious ideas. The secret wasn't necessarily the information. The secret was the shared possession of it. The fact that you and the man across the aisle from you, in the lamplight, both knew, and the man up on the street outside, going about his ordinary day, didn't and never would, unless he too went through the door and ducked his head and climbed down. That's a kind of bond that doesn't require the secret to be important in any external sense to function. It only requires the secret to be shared and the sharing to be exclusive. And I think, though this is, again, me speculating, reaching past what the evidence can strictly support, I think that might be closer to the emotional core of this whole religion than the cosmology, the ages of the world, the precession of the equinoxes, any of it. Not, here is the truth about the universe. More like, here is a room. Come inside and shut the door, and now there's an us. Let me try, now near the end, to say something about what happened to all of this afterward. Not the religion itself, which we've established was, by the early medieval period, simply gone, its temples buried or built over or both, but the idea of it, the shape it left behind. For more than 1,000 years, almost nobody knew this story existed. The buried Mithraea stayed buried, sometimes quite literally, under churches, under houses, under streets that got paved and repaved across centuries. The original ground level rising slowly above them, the way ground levels do in cities that have been continuously inhabited for a very long time, until the original doorway, the one a Batavian commander or a Roman freedman would once have ducked through, might end up 10 or 15 feet below the modern surface, reachable only by accident. A foundation dug for a new building, a sewer line, a bomb crater after an air raid. That last one isn't hypothetical, by the way. The London Mithraeum, one of the most famous of all the rediscovered sites, was found in 1954 during the rebuilding of a bombed-out section of the city after the Second World War, when workers clearing a site for a new office building hit, a few feet down, the unmistakable outline of a long, narrow room with benches along either side, and, eventually, a head, a marble head of Mithras himself, wearing his Persian cap, his face turned, as the type always shows him, slightly to one side, as if he'd been interrupted in the middle of looking at something else. The discovery caused, by the standards of archaeological news, something close to a sensation. Thousands of Londoners queued in the rubble of their bombed city to look down into a hole in the ground at a god most of them had never heard of, who had been worshipped by other Londoners in that exact spot nearly 2,000 years before. Londoners who had also presumably lived through their own version of disruption and rebuilding, their own version of a city trying to put itself back together after something had torn through it. I think about that overlap sometimes. Not because it proves anything. It doesn't prove anything. It's just a coincidence of geography and time. But because it's the kind of thing this whole story keeps doing, if you let it. Laying one moment over another. A bombed city and a buried god. A church built directly on top of a cave that was also the cosmos. An empire ending slowly enough that nobody could point to the day it happened, the same way an astronomical age ends slowly enough that nobody can point to the day that happens either. The Mithraeum that was found in London has since been reconstructed, moved actually more than once, as the office buildings above it were themselves demolished and rebuilt. The underground room essentially evicted and resettled a couple of times over the following decades, before finally being restored relatively recently in something close to its original location, with the lighting and sound designed deliberately, I think rather effectively, to recreate something of the atmosphere. Low light, a recorded murmur of chanting, the shapes of the room emerging slowly out of darkness as your eyes adjust, the way they would have had to adjust all those centuries ago, for a man ducking through a low door with nothing but an oil lamp held out in front of him. People visit it now, office workers mostly on their lunch breaks, since it sits beneath the offices of a financial institution in the middle of London's banking district, which is its own kind of strange juxtaposition, a god of contracts and oaths buried beneath an organization whose entire existence is, in some sense, also about contracts and oaths, though I doubt very many of the people walking through on a Tuesday afternoon are thinking about it in quite those terms. They look at the reconstructed benches, the replica altar, the careful lighting. Some of them, I'd guess, feel something. It's hard not to, in a space designed as carefully as that one is, to make you feel something. And then they go back upstairs, back to their desks, back to the daylight, and the room goes dark again behind them, waiting, the way it's apparently quite good at waiting for whoever comes down next. I should say something before we close about why this particular religion, out of all the cults and mysteries and brotherhoods that existed across the Roman world, most of which have left us even less than Mithraism has, seems to keep getting found again. Not just physically, in the ground, though that's part of it, but found again in the sense of being picked up, dusted off, written about, argued over every few decades by new generations of scholars and enthusiasts, and yes, people making podcasts about it late at night for an audience they can't see and mostly can't hear from. Part of it, I think, is simply the shape of the evidence. A religion with almost enough surviving material to reconstruct, but not quite. Enough images that you can see the outline of something coherent. The Tauroctony's rigid, repeated composition, the 7 grades, the planetary associations, but not enough text to know for certain what any of it actually meant to the people experiencing it. That gap is, for some people, the most attractive feature any historical puzzle can have. A shape with a hole in the middle of it, just the right size and just the right shape to invite you to imagine what used to be there. But I think there's something else too, something less about the puzzle and more about the content of what we do know. And this is the part where I'll admit, finally, near the end, to something I've been circling around all night without quite saying outright. There's a reason the comparisons to early Christianity keep coming up in this story, even though I've tried not to lean on them too heavily, because I think they can become a kind of trap, a way of only ever seeing one religion through the other, as if Mithraism only matters insofar as it might be a rough draft of something else. But the comparisons exist because for a brief window, a couple of centuries in the grand scheme of things, which sounds long until you remember how long this whole story has been. These two religions were, in some sense, competing for the same room. Not literally, most of the time, but for the same kind of person. A man in the Roman world, in the 2nd or 3rd century, looking for something, a brotherhood, an explanation, a place to belong that the official religion of temples and sacrifices and civic festivals didn't quite provide, had, among his options, a god who'd been born holding light, who killed a bull so the world could live, who ate a sacred meal with the sun, who promised, we think, though we can't be sure, that the soul could climb back up through the spheres it had fallen through, grade by grade, name by name, until it arrived somewhere better than where it started. One of those religions kept its rooms small, dark, hidden, exclusive. Open the door, climb down, take the oath, and then you're in. And even then, only part way, with years of climbing still ahead of you. The other opened its doors. Anyone. No grades to climb before you belonged. Belonging came first, and the climbing, such as it was, came after and was framed differently as growth rather than gatekeeping. I'm not saying that difference explains everything. History is never that simple, and there were 100 other factors, political and economic and military, that shaped which religions thrived and which didn't. Factors that have nothing to do with doors or rooms at all. But I keep coming back to it anyway, on nights like this, telling this particular story. A god in a small dark room, asking you to prove yourself before you could stay. And a door just down the street, standing open. So, here we are, beneath the streets, beneath the churches, beneath the office buildings and the bomb craters and the centuries of pavement laid down one on top of another. There's still, here and there, a low room with benches along the walls, facing each other, waiting for lamps that mostly don't get lit anymore. The god in the corner is still turning his head away from the bull, still looking toward the sun, his cloak still full of stars that someone painted very carefully 2,000 years ago for an audience of maybe 30 people at a time, men whose names we mostly don't know, who climb down through that door again and again across their whole lives, becoming ravens, then soldiers, then lions, then, some of them, fathers, presiding at the end over the same low room where they'd once knelt as the youngest man present. The religion didn't survive. I want to be honest about that one more time before we close, because there's a temptation in stories like this to suggest some kind of secret continuity, that the old gods never really left, that they're still down there, waiting, that the symbols got smuggled into other traditions and are quietly still operating under different names. Maybe some of that is true, in fragments, in echoes, the way ideas always leave traces in whatever comes after them. But the cult itself, the brotherhood, the 7 grades, the actual men climbing the actual ladder, that ended centuries ago, buried gently or otherwise, and largely forgotten, until the ground gave it back, piece by piece, room by room, in basements and bomb sites and the foundations of buildings whose owners had no idea what they were standing on top of. What's left is the shape of it, the idea of a god born already holding light, the idea of an act of violence that produces, somehow, life, wheat from a wound, a whole world from a single death. The idea of a brotherhood built not on what you were before you walked through the door, but on what you became after. The idea of darkness built deliberately so that light could mean something when it finally arrived. I think that shape is older than any single religion that's ever worn it, and I suspect it'll outlast whatever wears it next too. Not because anyone's keeping it alive on purpose, but because it seems to be the kind of shape that human beings keep reaching for, generation after generation, whether or not they know where it came from. A room, a door, a flame in the dark that someone eventually lights. That's the story for tonight. Wherever you're listening, whatever room you're in, however dark it's gotten while I've been talking, I hope it's found you somewhere comfortable, somewhere warm enough, somewhere quiet enough to let the rest of the evening just sort of dissolve, the way evenings do when you stop fighting them. There's nothing else you need to do tonight, nothing else to climb, nothing else to prove, no grades, no oaths, no doors to duck through. Just this, the dark settling in, and a voice that's about to stop talking. Good night.